Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, is this the end of Keir Starmer? Or will Morgan McSweeney be the handy fall guy? It turns out that Starmer also has questions to answer over an off-books visit to Palantir in Washington, and lastly, an extinction-level event of layoffs that are hitting the Washington Post. I'm Helena, aka No Justice MTG, and I'm joined tonight by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, it's a Thursday, it's my favourite day of the week. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I mean, it's fitting for Ladies' Night that we are going to spend the whole evening talking about the worst men that have ever existed. So I guess that's somewhat fitting.
True. I think it is absolutely a fitting way to discuss these stories. If anything, it's best to get your imperfect insights as well, Dalia, as always. Before we get into tonight's stories, we just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's signed up to become a paid supporter this week. It's been a pretty crazy news cycle with news stories breaking every single day. And with that, thousands more of you tuning in each night for rigorous, reliable reporting. Stories like these are fast moving, and it really is all thanks to our supporters that we have the capacity to be across them with such depth and diligence, and we will continue to be. If you valued our coverage, please do consider signing up to become a monthly supporter. Anything from £1 a month really does have an impact. Head to novaramedia.com/support if you'd like to chip in. The Starmer administration was in crisis mode this morning after the fallout from yesterday's revelations regarding the appointment of disgraced peer Peter Mandelson as UK ambassador to Washington. This follows a vote in the Commons last night to force the government to make public the assessments from Mandelson's vetting process during his appointment, an appointment that Starmer now admits was made after he was informed about Mandelson's links to sex trafficking financier Jeffrey Epstein. Keir Starmer was due to speak this morning about the government's local regeneration scheme, but started his press conference by addressing the Mandelson scandal.
Let me be clear, no one is above accountability. And no one, however well connected, however experienced, however senior, should hold public office if they cannot meet the basic test of honesty. I also want to address the publication of the information Mandelson provided during the appointment process. I understand the strength of public feeling. I share the anger that people feel when powerful individuals appear to escape scrutiny. And I want to be able to release those documents as quickly as possible. I wanted to release them yesterday, in fact, and to talk about them at Prime Minister's questions. But the police have advised that releasing certain information now could risk prejudicing a future investigation or legal process. And however frustrating from my personal point of view that is, and it is, I will not take any step, however politically tempting, however popular, that risks justice for victims. Because this is not and must never become a political game. The victims of Epstein have lived with trauma that most of us can barely comprehend. And they've had to relive it again and again. They have seen accountability delayed and too often denied. To them, I want to say this. I am sorry. Sorry for what was done to you. Sorry that so many people with power failed you. Sorry for having believed Mandelson's lies and appointed him.
We'll get to the hypocrisy of Starmer admonishing others for lying later, but for now, the media focuses on one important question. How much did Starmer know about Mandelson's Epstein links at the time? He admitted that he was aware that Mandelson was an associate of Epstein in Prime Minister's questions yesterday afternoon, the extent of which is what will be presumably uncovered in the vetting documents due to eventually be aired to the public. This question was put to the Housing Minister Steve Reed this morning on Good Morning Britain.
They did know.
They didn't know.
It was reported in the Financial Times.
They didn't.
And that information was also given to the Prime Minister at a press conference that Mandelson had spent nights at Epstein's mansion in New York. Now, you don't spend time in someone's private house unless you're pretty close to them.
While they were serving their sentence, while Epstein was in prison.
So, of course, you knew.
And there are documents that will be released to explain exactly what Mandelson said about that. But what Mandelson did was he lied and pretended his relationship with Epstein had finished, and that even when the relationship had been ongoing, it was next to nothing. He barely knew him. They had very little contact. That is what Mandelson said. The vetting process didn't show up anything that contradicted that, and so the appointment was made.
Mr.
We
Reid,
now know
Steve Reid,
that
we are
Mandelson was
looking
lying,
at
deceiving and manipulating.
We are looking at photographs of Lord Mandelson with Jeffrey Epstein. We know he slept at his house. We know about his connection with Jeffrey
Photographs that
Epstein.
came out after he'd been appointed. None of this was known at the time. As soon as the Prime Minister found out months ago that Mandelson had deceived him, was manipulative in the answers that he gave to the questions during the vetting process, as soon as the Prime Minister found out about it, he sacked Mandelson on the spot. Mandelson was woken up at 5 a.m. and told he was sacked as the UK's ambassador to the United States because the Prime Minister took decisive action the moment he found out that Peter Mandelson had lied to him.
Yes,
this wasn't just yesterday, this was months ago when the Prime Minister found out what had really been going on.
Now, here is the press conference that Jim Pickard put the question to Keir Starmer about the links between Epstein and Mandelson. Now, this is from January 2024, so that's before the general election. Let's take a look.
The FT did a report this summer on a JP Morgan report which suggested that Peter Mandelson had stayed at the New York townhouse of Jeffrey Epstein in 2009 when he was de facto deputy prime minister, and while the financier was imprisoned for soliciting prostitution from a minor. Do you think that Lord Mandelson, who is of course a close political ally of yours, has some questions to answer?
On Peter Mandelson, look, and I do try to give pretty full answers in these sessions, I don't know any more than you do. And therefore, there's not really much I can add to what you already know, I'm afraid. And, that's simply the state of the affairs.
So let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that actually there was actually no knowledge at the time of the appointment of the actual links between Mandelson and Epstein when Starmer appointed him. If you've been told publicly before the election, this was in January 2024, way before he was ever appointed, that there was even a potential link between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Mandelson, right? If you even thought there might be a potential link there, did you not think to check the Financial Times' reporting? Was it not worth checking the information that had come out of that JP Morgan investigation about the links between the two? When he says stuff like, well, I only know as much as you do, well, the knowledge that was in those documents, the knowledge that was publicized in 2023, so a year before that particular press conference, made it extremely clear all the information that Susanna Reid and Richard Madeley were putting to Steve Reid in the clip that we watched. All of those photos that were being played on the reel during that conversation where Steve Reid is saying all of those photos were released after the appointment, that doesn't make sense. That does not make sense because that information was in the documentation that was mentioned by Jim Pickard in that press conference from before the election. So it's a position that really doesn't hold up to any amount of scrutiny. Now, it's all the hallmarks of Starmer's inadequacy for high office, lack of foresight, disinterest in public scrutiny, and the protection of party interests over national interests on display throughout this saga. The question remains, of course, can Starmer's premiership be saved? Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey wondered much the same today. The British people can't afford for this Labour soap opera to drag on for months. Let's have a confidence vote now to see whether Labour MPs have any confidence in their Prime Minister so the government can move on one way or the other and focus on the change our country needs. Now, he may not get a confidence vote, of course, but we are slowly getting to understand just how many Labour MPs actually have confidence in him more broadly. Former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell openly called for Starmer to consider his position as PM when speaking to Channel 4 last night.
It calls to question Keir's judgment. And I think Keir needs to think himself about whether he's the right person to continue on now. And many feel he should move on. And it would be better for us as a party and as a country if he does that.
Right, but even if you had a leadership election and a new leader, isn't this so huge that the damage to the Labour brand caused by Peter Mandelson is unrecoverable now?
I think it's really difficult to see us recovering whilst Keir is there, almost defending the decision he took.
Well, why would anyone else make a difference?
Because actually we need a new clean broom. It's as simple as that. Sometimes you just have to clear out the stable, don't you? And I think that's what we have to do now. And it is about Mandelson, but it's also about the influence of corporations and other rich individuals too. We need a fresh approach to restore confidence for Labour. We could be losing a government here as a result of this issue. That's how risky this is. I think we could have a caretaker leader for a period of time while we sort this mess out and then go.
Well, it's clearly an argument you need to have.
It's a big argument that's going on in the tea room.
Both of you.
Now, it remains to be seen whether the Labour brand is recoverable, as McDonnell seems to think that it is, but the idea that just a quick change in leadership would be enough to be able to assuage the concerns of voters, I don't necessarily think that that's true. But it's certain that the only way is down if Starmer stays on, and I think John McDonnell is correct in his assessment there. And it's not just the socialist left implying that Starmer is toast here. This was veteran Labour MP Barry Gardiner on Newsnight last night with some pretty choice words for the embattled Prime Minister.
Look, this was our manifesto, right? One man, one word, change. Yeah. That's what we promised. That was the whole of what we as the Labour Party promised this country, change. This looks more like the same.
Should he step down?
I think that he needs to think very hard about what is in the country's best interest and what is in his party's best interest.
It's a veiled yes. You're saying that you don't want to say it, but you're saying it with your eyes.
Oh, it's quite the stare there from Gardiner, wasn't it? And he's not the only one to link Starmer's actions with that of the previous administration. Here's the Scottish National Party Stephen Flynn on Peston last night with an even more explicit comparison.
The Prime Minister admitted today that he knew that there was evidence that Peter Mandelson continued his relationship after he knew about the sex crimes. What could be in the vetting document to let the Prime Minister off the hook?
I'm going to guess nothing. And, you know, I think at this point, the Prime Minister's position is verging on untenable. Look, he's not a bad person like Boris Johnson. He's not bonkers like Liz Truss has rapidly become, but he's done the same thing as they did and made a catastrophic error of judgment. And in doing so, he's eroded any trust that the public can have in him. And it's inconceivable to me that the Labour Party can say to the public, you need to trust this Prime Minister to make the big decisions that are going to impact your lives, when he proactively chose to ignore the evidence that we all knew was available, whether it was The Guardian, whether it was Jim Pickard at the FT, whether it was indeed just Google and searches that we can all basically do, that Peter Mandelson had continued to have a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, that he'd stayed in the guy's house when he was a convicted paedophile, and the Prime Minister still thought it was right that he takes on the plum diplomatic role for the United Kingdom and the USA. I really struggle to see how he can continue.
Now, it is interesting just how much we currently feel like we're going through like the downfall of Boris Johnson all over again. It's really kind of an interesting parallel from like the Chris Pincher comparison all the way down to just the feeling of one man against the tide that seems inevitable, resulting in his resignation. And given the propensity of both Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson's for lying, I mean, in the public mind, there was a big Savanta word cloud done that showed that Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer are hugely seen by the public primarily as being liars, as being people that you can't trust. One question to you, Dalia. Just how similar is Keir Starmer to Boris Johnson?
Well, I mean, there are the obvious, almost quite eerie parallels between the way that this seems to be going for Keir Starmer and how things ended for Boris Johnson, as you mentioned. But just to remind our audience, because it did happen like several world-changing events ago. So I wouldn't be surprised if people forgot. But the thing that ultimately brought down Boris Johnson's government was the fact that he was willing to continue to defend an accused sexual predator, so Chris Pincher. And that was the thing that ultimately led to his demise. Now, Peter Mandelson is, of course, he has not been accused himself of any sexual misconduct, but the depth of his relationship with a convicted sex criminal, with and the seeming kind of lack of seriousness with which Mandelson approached it. We see in the files him sending an email to Epstein referring to Epstein's release from prison as Liberation Day and joking about hiring strippers to celebrate Epstein being released from prison. So it speaks to a similar kind of abject moral character that I'm not particularly surprised that someone who was known as the Prince of Darkness was had. So the parallels are clear. Starmer, like Johnson, is at a point in his premiership where he's deeply unpopular publicly. He's deeply unpopular within his own party. There's kind of a rack of offences that has built up, and also a rack of resentments and frustrations within his own party who aren't really willing to go to bat for him anymore. And then we finally have this kind of scandal, in which the Prime Minister is seen to be defending the indefensible and trying to cover his tracks. And the fallout, as it did for Boris Johnson, the fallout for Keir Starmer seems to be spiraling out of control. And it's very funny because when Starmer was in opposition, you and I and lots of other people came on Novara, and we would constantly say how all that Starmer is offering is Toryism, but with a bit more decorum. And it turns out they couldn't even manage that. It turns out that once again, despite our subterranean expectations of what a Starmer government would provide, they managed to even go lower, to even not meet those expectations. Now, normal people, sort of like you and I, might look at this and think, why do these prime ministers or these leaders keep making the same mistake? Like, surely Starmer would have seen what happened with Boris Johnson and seen that, when you cover for someone where it's very clear that you were aware of their, moral failures that would be not taken very well by the public, by the party, and then you try and lie and cover it up, or allegedly lie and cover it up, that these are the kinds of things that lead to the ends of careers. Why do they think routinely that they can get away with it? And the answer is that 9 times out of 10, they do get away with it. For every time that we only hear about these scandals when they don't pay off, when they go wrong. And for every time that we, as the regular public, hear about these things, there are several instances where it actually turns out completely fine. And if anything, when you are a power-hungry person, you actually like to keep people with big secrets very close, because when someone has a big secret and you do them a favor, you get the thing that if you are mindlessly power hungry, you get the thing that you want and that you most prize, which is not principles, not values, not even being intelligent, necessarily good at your job or intelligent, but you get loyalty. And so if anything, it's actually quite often the strategic calculation pays off to keep someone with a big secret very close, because you get the most valuable currency in Westminster, which is loyalty. And I have to kind of go even a little bit further here, which is to say that there's been a lot of shock and horror that Starmer would hire Mandelson, in spite of knowing that he had a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. But I think the sad truth of it is actually it's because of the kind of access and connections that someone like Mandelson has because of their relationship with someone like Epstein. because they had that relationship with someone like Epstein, that's actually why Starmer hired him. And Starmer might not have known exactly how the sausage was made, but he wanted the sausage. And, you know, I'm sure that he's not entirely naive about the kinds of things that you have to do to get access to that kind of power. Now, that's not to say that Starmer knew about the depths of it, but we have to remember that Starmer hired Mandelson precisely as a signal to the establishment to say, don't worry, that whole Corbyn thing was a big old mess. It was a big blip on the radar. We're back on the court and we're playing ball. So he didn't necessarily think that it would come and backfire on him in this way, but that was the purpose of hiring Peter Mandelson. And Starmer's made his bed and now he's got to lie in it.
What's interesting about the comparison between Johnson and Starmer is that when it comes to Johnson, I felt like he lied opportunistically to save his own skin, whereas Keir Starmer's entire political project is one based in subterfuge and deceit. From day one, from the very day, I mean, even when he was a shadow minister, things weren't exactly going tickety-boo in the background in terms of the way he acted, for example, as shadow Brexit secretary, and then the plotting in the background with Labour together, which we will get onto, don't you worry, chat. But when it comes to the project they even sold to the country, it was a pamphlet manifesto that didn't have the full details of the kind of things that they were going to do in government, all the way down to the conspiracy of silence about potential tax rises or spending cuts in the run-up to the election. He's made his bread and butter out of political subterfuge, and the public can see it. It's why people make these comparisons and why I do not buy the clarion call that we're getting from people in the media like Tom Baldwin about his being a fundamentally decent man. I'm like, decent people don't make careers out of lies. And that's what the public can see in Keir Starmer. And that's what has become, ironically, his downfall, potentially, at the end of the day. Now, it is not just Keir Starmer whose position is threatened by the Mandelson files. His closest confidant, long-term mentor and current Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney is also in the firing line from Labour backbenchers. Here's Nicholas Watt on Newsnight passing on the words of an anonymous MP.
Now, I began by saying the two words associated with today are he knew. One former member of the government said to me, no, the two words that should be associated with today are Morgan out. Get rid, they're saying, of Morgan McSweeney, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, who was instrumental in that appointment. And I have to say, I've learnt tonight that Starmer loyalists have been going to the whips and saying, we've helped you, you need to help us, you need to help the Labour Party, get him out and put him in charge of Labour campaigning.
Other MPs were happy to put their name to such calls for his removal. Here's Times political editor Stephen Swinford with some more intel on the brewing revolt. Labour backbenchers are now publicly warning Sir Keir Starmer that his own future will be in doubt unless he sacks his Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney. It's effectively an ultimatum that's being echoed across the backbenches. Carl Turner, a Labour MP, says the mood on the backbenches is dire. He says that unless Starmer sacks his Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney, he'll be up against it and have to make a decision about his own future. Although one would have to take issue with the idea that McSweeney is only at fault for quote-unquote bad advice, when the reality is that his recommendation of Mandelson for the ambassadorial role is part and parcel of a much deeper relationship between McSweeney and Mandelson that goes back a long time. Here's investigative journalist Paul Holden for the iPaper. McSweeney is no stranger to Mandelsonian dark arts. McSweeney and Mandelson's relationship goes back to 2001. Indeed, Mandelson himself was soon injected into the very heart of the Starmer project. One of McSweeney's first jobs in the Labour Party was to input information into the famous Excalibur system, the Labour supercomputer that collected intelligence on opponents of New Labour, including Labour MPs, pioneered and run by Mandelson. According to McSweeney's sympathetic biographer, Rachel Wearmouth, it was during this experience that the two grew to know and trust each other, and Mandelson remained a key influence on McSweeney's thinking. Paul Holden's book, The Fraud, details exactly how McSweeney became the Labour grandee he is today, and how he plotted to oust the left from the Labour Party via his think tank Labour Together. We spoke to him on our Downstream podcast about his links to the Starmer project, so we won't get into that right now. We'll leave a link to the full episode in the description for you, so you can view it at your viewing pleasure later. What he has shown repeatedly is just how close Mandelson was to both McSweeney and Keir Starmer. It was since the ill-fated 2021 Hartlepool by-election that McSweeney really took full hold of the reins of Starmer's tenure as leader of the Labour Party, with Mandelson at his side the whole time, with a colleague allegedly remarking to the New Statesman that McSweeney would not even breathe without consulting Mandelson first. And this close relationship continued throughout Mandelson's time as ambassador. Here's Sky News' political editor Sam Coates.
When Peter Mandelson was ambassador to the US, he used to speak to Morgan McSweeney several times a week. Over the summer of last year, Morgan McSweeney's wife had a fundraiser. She's an MP, by the way. Lord Mandelson, then ambassador, went to that fundraiser. They go back years, and there are quotes from Peter Mandelson praising Morgan McSweeney. Now, he is an absolutely critical figure, the bedrock figure for Keir Starmer.
That Imogen Walker, by the way, is one of the many MPs that were parachuted into Labour safe seats with no input from party members, and that's part of McSweeney and the Labour right strategy of controlling Labour selections. That's a process which the I-Paper allege Mandelson was directly involved in, although Labour deny this. This is why the call coming from Keir Starmer and his allies about all of this being a mistake or an error in judgment falls totally flat. Mandelson was appointed for political reasons, especially given there was already a perfectly suitable and well-liked ambassador already in place. And it was McSweeney who pushed for him to be given the position, and reportedly pleaded with Starmer not to remove him even after the first round of revelations about Mandelson's birthday messages to Epstein became public knowledge. That's the yum-yum messages, for those who are not realising the reference. The problem for Keir Starmer, however, is that he is nothing without Morgan McSweeney. I once described the two of them on this very show as being like Keith Harris and Orville. Keir Starmer has no political project, no policy vision, and no prospectus for government without McSweeney to dictate it to him, and his own colleagues admit it as such. In the book Get In by Patrick Maguire and Gebrial Pogrund, they allege that a member of Keir Starmer's inner circle told them this. Keir's not driving the train. He thinks he's driving the train, but we've sat him at the front of the Docklands Light Railway, which is a driverless train, for what it's worth. An amusing admission, if it weren't for the fact that this is exactly the appraisal that had been made of Starmer from members of the Labour left before him and his mentor had been given a giant majority, with very little actual scrutiny in the run-up to the election. If the mainstream media had done their job by publicising the power of Morgan McSweeney and his links to people like Peter Mandelson before the election, maybe we would not be in this position after all. Regardless, McSweeney may become the fall guy to provide a stay of execution on Starmer's premiership. But without him, the Prime Minister will become a lifeless ventriloquist stole, aimlessly occupying number 10, and his time would soon be up also. Dalia, a Labour source last night, told the BBC that the Labour right were essentially losing control of the Labour Party. Do you really think that this is the end?
I think it's probably the end for Starmer and McSweeney, but whether it's the end for the Labour right as a whole, I'm not entirely sure, because one thing that McSweeney has done actually quite effectively, and the thing that he was sort of recruited to do, is completely evacuate any kind of infrastructure or presence of the left in the party. And he's done that in a way that has not been recovered yet. And I think it's going to take quite a long time to recover. And we can see, for example, blocking Andy Burnham. We can see in the lining up of Wes Streeting. They are thinking, the Labour right and the vested interests that back the Labour right are thinking in a forward-looking manner and quite strategically for where does the party go after Starmer. And, Wes Streeting is their guy. And they are lining up their ducks in a row quite neatly to ensure that there isn't any challenge to that, because they do know that if it was put to a Labour vote, not just amongst the members, but even also among MPs, that Andy Burnham would probably beat Wes Streeting. And so they did what they do best and just eliminated any viable opposition. The thing about McSweeney, and that in a sense, McSweeney can now leave knowing that he did what he was meant to do. because McSweeney had one job, and that job wasn't to beat the far right, which is the kind of myth, the story that we have been told. McSweeney's job was to beat the left. And that's a mission that he and Peter Mandelson both share. In a sense, Morgan McSweeney is Peter Mandelson's heir. You know, when it's a mission that both Mandelson and McSweeney have executed. They have executed quite well, and they have been mostly handsomely rewarded for it. You know, now we are sort of seeing the beginning of that downfall, but that doesn't mean that the role that McSweeney and Mandelson inhabit historically in the Labour Party itself has been abolished. And we can see in the files that whenever a remotely left-wing policy or left-wing figure begins to rise within the ranks of the Labour Party. For example, when Alistair Darling introduced a one-off 50% tax on bankers' bonuses, or when Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, we see Mandelson working tirelessly to ensure that those policies and those leaders don't get anywhere near government and don't get anywhere near being put into practices. And McSweeney is the legacy of that. McSweeney is our Mandelson of today in that sense. He is there to ensure that anything that can remotely be seen as a genuinely anti-establishment Labour movement, he is there to make sure that the Labour Party does not become a vessel for that. So it doesn't surprise me, for example, that they worked very closely together to make sure that the parliamentary candidate selections were, kept on a very, very tight leash. It doesn't surprise me that it seems like McSweeney looked to Mandelson as a kind of mentor, because they both occupy the same function within the Labour Party, which is to represent the interests of power within a party that, because of its, reputation as being a centre-left party, because of its relationship with the trade union movement, has always been a space that the elites have to keep a very close eye on. They don't have to spend a lot of time really infiltrating and lobbying the Tory party, because the Tory party, by its essence, represents its interests. It's the Conservative Party. Its job is to conserve the existing order of power. The Labour Party has always been a place, and we can see with the election of Jeremy Corbyn, has always been a place where things can get a little out of hand. Things can go a little off script. And so the powerful have always made sure that the Mandelsons and the McSweeneys of the world have a solid footing in that party to make sure that it never actually represents the working class, that it never actually represents, despite its name, the Labour movement. So, will McSweeney's career end here? Perhaps, I don't know. People have been able to shake off the stench of much worse. But do I think the function that McSweeney and Mandelson have held now and historically has been eliminated? No. And I think we're still quite a long way off from rebuilding the left within the Labour Party. So we'll have to sort of wait and see on that front.
Like I mentioned before, there was no real scrutiny of Morgan McSweeney in the run-up to the election. And we're all seeing the press kind of dump on Mandelson now. But it is worth pointing out also that, again, the revelations about Epstein were available, and the revelations about Mandelson's links to Epstein were available from 2023. And it basically seems like it was just really the FT that was running pieces on this. So much so that Mandelson described it as being an obsession of the Financial Times, when this is, again, it's really important stuff to be considering, And it's these kind of things, but there was no questioning broadly for the mainstream media about someone like Mandelson, who we all knew had lots of links to Keir Starmer at the time, and likewise was McSweeney. But there's a reason why the press are dumping on Mandelson now, but they're not quite doing as much on McSweeney, because it's all about access. You're absolutely right, Dalia. McSweeney is the Mandelson of today. And we've all seen the photo going round of McSweeney having a cosy little briefing chat with Beth Rigby from Sky News, and they don't want to lose access. They can't be that critical of people like McSweeney because he is the access to government. It is why, of course, the press was so vilifying of someone like Jeremy Corbyn, because there was no access figure. There was no access figure. Jeremy Corbyn in the Commons discussing the Mandelson affair was very explicit in saying, I would never have someone like Peter Mandelson in my Labour government. I would never have him giving access, right? And there was no other figure like him for the press to latch onto. And this is the axis of power that exists broadly within our political and media class. And this is really what the big problem lies. The big problem lies is that there is a circular firing squad. There is mutually assured destruction within our political and media class, with briefers and leakers and the lobby journalists that need their access, that means that proper scrutiny of the political actors never happens outside of people, of course, like independent media, Novara Media being one example. Consider going to novaramedia.com/support, because, again, we were discussing the issues around Mandelson at the time in the way that the FT was, and nowhere else that I can remember was doing so at the time. And that's because, again, we aren't people with access to people like McSweeney and Mandelson, so we're going to be the ones scrutinising them. And again, we're in this position where McSweeney has essentially become the shadow prime minister, all-powerful, again, more powerful as far as I can see than Keir Starmer. And this is after an election when he should have been scrutinised more than he was. Thank you, Ishtak, for the $4.99. Starmer actively created a vacancy to put Mandelson in. Poor Karen Pierce was the best person for that role after years of experience. I mean, that is true. Like, so many lines have been, oh, well, we had to appoint an ambassador and Mandelson happened to be there and a good fit. And I'm like, no, you did not have to appoint an ambassador. There was already an ambassador, and a well-liked one by the Trump administration as well. Liked by the Biden admin too. This was not somebody who was being disliked by Trump that it became necessary to remove them from their post and to replace them with Mandelson, but they thought they could get political gain from it and didn't consider that there might be consequences, right? They thought they would have total impunity to use the ambassadorial role for a political appointment in the interests of their own interest, their party interest, over the country, over the national interest. Again, a thing that they said in the run-up to the election that they would not do. They said it was country above party. And clearly, if we're reading what the people are saying about the internal factional war within the Labour Party as well, it's actually not even necessarily about the party itself, which we can see the poll ratings of what Starmer's doing to that party right now. It's actually faction over party over country when it comes to people like the Politburo and the Labour right. Now, before we move on to our next story, a quick reminder that the Cortado, our most popular newsletter, lands in your inbox every Monday and Friday morning, and it's free. So why not start your week and, of course, end it as well with the spiciest takes on the biggest stories, fresh from the desks of our own very own Ash Sarkar and Stephen Methan. Head to novara.media/the Cortado to get it in your inbox tomorrow.
We have dedicated our company to the service of the West and the United States of America, and we're super proud of the role we play, especially in places we can't talk about. And we love our success in the U.S. and globally. Also, we are doing in the United Kingdom and many other places. Palantir is here to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when it's necessary, to scare enemies and, on occasion, kill them.
That was Alex Karp, CEO of US tech firm Palantir, speaking in February last year. As it happens, that was just a few weeks before British Prime Minister Keir Starmer visited Karp at his company's offices in Washington. That visit is now subject to new scrutiny, piling fresh pressure on Starmer, a politician already floundering. But why? Because of the rising urgency around the question, just how much did we know, and when, about Peter Mandelson's relationship with convicted sex criminal billionaire Jeffrey Epstein? So far, his excuse for being so chummy with Mandelson only a year ago, even though he admitted to knowing that Mandelson's relationship with Epstein continued beyond the billionaire's 2008 child sex conviction, is that the former ambassador lied to him about the details. Maybe. But it's also very clear that Mandelson, with his love of billionaires and the super-rich, was exceptionally useful to a government willing to do almost anything for a positive economic message. And that's where Keir Starmer may find himself in hot water of his own making. In an angry parliamentary debate on Wednesday, Tory MP Alex Burkhardt made a revelation.
On the 27th of February 2025, the Prime Minister, whilst in Washington, visited the American data and AI company Palantir at its headquarters. The meeting did not appear in the Prime Minister's register of visits. It only came to light later. Now, Palantir, we should remember or remind ourselves, was a client of Global Counsel, the company in which Peter Mandelson had a commanding share. Later that year, Palantir received from this government a £240 million deal.
British companies couldn't compete.
That deal was granted by direct award. Given the allegations now coming to light, about Mandelson's conduct, can the Minister assure the House that the Cabinet Secretary will review the circumstances around the award of that contract and assure himself that there are no other such contracts, no other undisclosed meetings, that the government is going to go through all of the communications that Mandelson sent out whilst he was ambassador, messages, we must assume, some of which were sent to old business contacts, potential few business contacts, and so on.
Now, this story isn't new. In April last year, the Good Law Project reported on the visit to the Donald Trump-aligned firm Palantir's Washington site, one that the Cabinet Office admitted was fixed by the very embassy that Mandelson had taken over just a few weeks before. The Good Law Project submitted a Freedom of Information request to the government about the visit with this result. In response to our Freedom of Information request, the Cabinet Office told us it was only an informal visit, a tour of the facilities, a short video presentation, and a meet and greet with staff members, so no minutes were kept. An off-books, unminuted personal visit with the head of a British government would be worth a lot of money to Palantir, a company looking to expand its war and surveillance technology around the world. This is footage from some of that meeting, showing Keir Starmer being personally instructed in Palantir's battlefield technology Sky Kit by the company's CEO Alex Karp. Also present was Louis Mosley, in the background on the right, grandson of British fascist Oswald Mosley and head of Palantir's UK operations. And as you can see, Peter Mandelson, our Peter, as Starmer once liked to say, was there too. Quite a packed-out audience for an informal visit, huh? So who stood to gain from the meeting? Well, as Burkhardt suggested there, one candidate is the company part-owned by Mandelson, and that has Palantir as a client. This is the website for Global Counsel, a firm that describes itself as offering global integrated consultancy services for clients working with public policy change. That's a lot of words for lobbyists. Global Counsel is pretty clear that they're in the business of helping to get government contracts for private companies. One of the services they offer companies in the tech sector is helping them to access public sector procurement opportunities, just like the ones Palantir would go on to win. And befitting a company that works to set up PFIs, its staff page is a who's who of former Downing Street advisors, civil servants, and figures connected to the Tony Blair government. But the direction of staff travel doesn't just go from former governments to Global Counsel. Sometimes it works in reverse as well. For example, there's Matt Bevington, who until September last year worked for Global Counsel, leaving around the same time that Mandelson was sacked as the ambassador. How curious. While in that role, he also worked for the PFI Promoting Future Governance Forum and penned research for the Tony Blair Institute. And just a few months after quitting Mandelson's firm, Bevington turned up as special advisor to Liz Kendall, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. Now, we are not suggesting any wrongdoing by Bevington, just illustrating the cosy interconnections of ministers, lobbyists, and vast private capital. And Palantir appears to have played that game too. Just 4 months after Keir Starmer's visit, Palantir UK boss Louis Mosley was invited to join the Ministry of Defence's Defence Industrial Joint Council, described as the MOD's main strategic mechanism for defence sector engagement. And, as Open Democracy has reported, in the months following Starmer's visit to the firm, Palantir hired 4 former Ministry of Defence officials, including an ex-minister. See how this all works? It wasn't long before it all paid off. Just a few months after that private meeting with Keir Starmer, Palantir saw a massive Ministry of Defence contract come its way, one worth £240 million. But it's not just killing robots and spyware that Palantir sells, it's also getting its hands on our health records. And it's been championed by other Labour ministers associated with Peter Mandelson. The Tories awarded Palantir in 2023 a £330 million contract to handle NHS England's patient data. A reminder, this is a company that sells surveillance and warfare technology to Israel for use against the Palestinians, and software to enable violent US immigration and customs enforcement, aka ICE raids, on undocumented people. Its founder, billionaire Peter Thiel, literally named it after Sauron's all-seeing sphere in Lord of the Rings. Since becoming Health Secretary, Wes Streeting has refused to reconsider Palantir's NHS contract, despite a huge groundswell of grassroots campaigning. And Palantir appears to remain the top choice to carry out Streeting's plan to make the NHS more efficient through artificial intelligence, a claim Streeting has not ruled out. But Streeting has himself had a close relationship with Mandelson in the past. We mentioned this earlier in the week, but it's worth repeating. It's an extract from a Guardian article published last month. In the opposition years, as part of attempts to rid Labour of Jeremy Corbyn and his acolytes, Mandelson was a member of a Sunday supper party held at the Kennington home of Roger Liddell, a fellow Labour peer and long-standing friend. Regular guests included the Health Secretary Wes Streeting and his partner Joe Dancy, himself a former Mandelson advisor. Streeting is said to have joked that a blue plaque might be put up outside Liddell's home given its role in the reinvention of Labour. In September last year, Streeting was quick to defend Mandelson after his notorious birthday book to Epstein surfaced.
The fact that he's written this letter to Jeffrey Epstein raised questions about his own judgment.
I think our ambassador has been very clear that he deeply regrets ever having been introduced to Epstein, and given what we now know about his horrific crimes, I mean, who would want to be associated with that sexual predator and paedophile? I don't think we should tar everyone with the same brush and do guilt by association.
Now, with a change in the political weather, Streeting has changed his tune as well.
I think all of us who thought we knew Peter Mandelson regret ever having known him. I think I cannot emphasise enough how angry and bitterly betrayed people, not just in the government, but across the Labour Party feel, because it's a betrayal of values.
But you stood by him, you sort of defended him last year when we already knew that he had a close friendship with Epstein. Do you now regret that?
Well, when Peter Mandelson was appointed as US ambassador, it was on the basis that he'd served successfully as this country's business secretary, that he had served as an EU trade commissioner. People thought he'd done those roles successfully. He'd been prominent in the media as a broadcaster, writing in newspapers. You're right, there had been some scrutiny of the Epstein relationship in the media, but he was continued to be given that platform and respectability.
In the wake of the latest Mandelson revelations, including the leaking of sensitive government information to Jeffrey Epstein, questions are now being quite rightly asked about his relationship with Palantir. Did Mandelson give that company access to sensitive government information whilst he was ambassador? Did he use his role as an ambassador to ease a meeting between the Prime Minister and the company's bosses? And questions are also being asked, by extension, about the relationships between the Prime Minister and other government ministers with the firm via Mandelson. Did they never ask questions about Mandelson's lobbying links to the company that Keir Starmer paid an off-books visit to? And how many other companies and billionaires are there out there with similar links? Green Party leader Zach Polanski has appeared on News9.
Can I say I think there's other serious consequences? So Palantir, this is the spy tech firm, $260 million last month, the biggest defence budget in UK history. That was lobbied by Global Counsel, which was Peter Mandelson's lobbying group, alongside Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, close friend of Peter Mandelson. I've written to the Health Secretary today to say we have to break that contract. It also has crucial data on our healthcare system. So the idea that this defence company from the US has its fingerprints all over our healthcare system alongside Peter Mandelson is a whole range of questions that need answers urgently.
Dalia, what does all of this say about the relationships between this government and Trump-aligned businesses?
I mean, I think it goes so much further than just this government and the specific Trump administration. It really speaks to the lens through which our world, you know, the economic and political order that we all live in, has been organized through for decades now. I mean, when we read through those files, obviously the primary victim of Epstein and the network that he brokered are the very young women and the girls that were trafficked by Epstein to various powerful men. You know, their bodies were exchanged as basically vessels that sort of kept of loyalty and secrecy that kept this network together. And, you know, those girls continue to be failed because ultimately, you know, who is actually being held accountable? I mean, we can't even get Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to go and testify and say what he knew, you know, which is the one thing that the lawyers representing a lot of these victims have asked for. So obviously the primary victim of Epstein's networks are those young women and girls. But I also think, in a sense, the secondary victim of the kind of networks that Epstein brokered were our society as a whole, because what Epstein was a power broker and he brokered power between a matrix of people who are literally in the business of making our world worse, who are in the business of concentrating power and resources in the hands of a very small number of people at the expense of all of us. And that is what we, I ask myself, how many futures, alternative futures, have we been robbed of because of these kinds of networks? And, Epstein is the one we obviously all know about. I'm sure there's others that we haven't heard about. But when we think about, for example, the way in which that one-off 50% bankers bonus was spoken about, we're seeing Peter Mandelson, who was meant to be a representative of the British government, trying to meet with an American bank, JP Morgan, to mildly threaten the government to scrap a policy that was largely popular amongst the British public and would have been good for the British public. Why? Because it cuts into the gravy train of the super rich. When we see, the trading of state secrets and state information in order for people to keep a seat at this table of power that Epstein was able to cultivate using the sexual exploitation of young girls, we can see how many times have the policies that we want to see in action, the leaders that we organically support, how many times globally have we seen these policies and movements and leaders sabotaged, sometimes completely in a way that feels very inexplicable, sabotaged and smeared. And it's because of these kinds of relationships and loyalties between largely men, but not just men, who are loyal to nothing but one another and nothing but the system that continues to make them rich at the expense of the rest of us. And PFI, much as we can say that so many policies and movements and people that the public support never become reality, we can also see the way in which things that have been notoriously terrible for the public, that we hate, continue to be pushed on us, despite continually trying to elect governments to offer something different. And PFI is almost the perfect crystallization of how, as you laid out there, Helena, lobbyists, private capital, and ministers conspire with one another to destroy everything that we hold dear. PFI was an absolute disgrace of a policy. It literally involved selling off infrastructure and services that should be public to the private sector, locking the government and therefore taxpayer money into 10, 15, 20, 25-year lucrative contracts, which basically means that these our schools and our hospitals and these things that we hold dear were not run according to what is in the public's best interest, but were run in order to continue in a way that would maximize the extraction of taxpayer money under the guise of running a school or a hospital or whatever, keeping profits high, costs low, making sure that, you can charge the government essentially giving you a blank check to maintain these schools and hospitals in ways that are not best for students, for patients, for the public, but are in ways that are the best for the people who run those companies. And for us, it was a disaster. But for the companies that won those PFI contracts, it was the easiest, most lucrative gravy train you could ever imagine, because you had a consumer, the government, that was never going to default, that was never going to default on the contract, and that was contractually obliged to cough up whatever you asked of it to continue running these services. And so PFI is almost like the crystallization of the kinds of networks that are brokered, which we can see in, for example, the Epstein files. And it's obviously, as you've mentioned, Helena, the very thing that Wes Streeting, who was very close to Peter Mandelson, who represents the kind of politics that the Morgan McSweeneys and the Peter Mandelsons are invested in, that's the legacy that he wants to uphold. He wants to keep that gravy train going. And it is because of these kinds of, I hate to use this word, but machinations of these individuals that everything that we care about and everything that we hold dear is being taken away from us and used as a profit-making opportunity by some of the worst people in the world.
What's interesting is I was watching LBC the other day, and it was Andrew Marr with John McDonnell saying, oh, well, there's always been these conspiracy theories on the Labour left about all of these connections between private capital and the Labour right. And I'm like, that's not a conspiracy theory. What you're describing, Andrew, is a conspiracy. What you're describing is the reality of what these people are like, and they do have these huge connections to private capital. Peter Oborn's done really good work about the changing face of how politics work in this country, and especially during the New Labour era, where party conference ended up being changed, essentially, so that rather than being about a meeting of members and a place to set policy, it became a place where they would dine and schmooze all the different people from the private sector who they wanted to get close to the government. And that's not changed. The Labour right is the legacy of the Blair administration, which is where all of these people, all of these high-profile grandees, and all of these political connections come from. It stands to reason why Tony Blair himself nowadays has his Tony Blair Institute, where he has all of these other connections through lobbying and all the other super rich people, and is somebody who's pushing all of these billionaire AI companies to get close to the government as well. So it is very interesting that, again, the left were just correct too early. Cursed to be Cassandra once again. Billionaire Amazon founder Jeff Bezos is also the owner of The Washington Post, perhaps the US's premier newspaper for investigative political journalism. Over its almost 150-year history, its journalism has won 76 Pulitzer Prizes. Most famously, it broke the Watergate scandal, leading to the downfall of former President Richard Nixon. But on Wednesday, Bezos decided to murder it, laying off hundreds of workers in what staff at the paper are calling an absolute bloodbath. About a third of the paper's newsroom is set to go, including entire international desks. This was from the Post's Cairo bureau chief. Laid off from the Washington Post, along with the entire roster of Middle East correspondents and our editors. Hard to understand the logic. But I am grateful for my incredible colleagues, whose grit and dedication to the reporting and each other I will miss dearly. The paper's Ukraine correspondent Lizzie Johnson wrote this from Kyiv. I was just laid off by the Washington Post in the middle of a war zone. I have no words. I'm devastated. In response to the slash-and-burn approach from the newspaper, its former editor Marty Barron wrote this. This ranks among the darkest days in the history of one of the world's greatest news organizations. The Washington Post's ambitions will be sharply diminished, its talented and brave staff will be further depleted, and the public will be denied the ground-level, fact-based reporting in our communities and around the world that is needed now more than ever. Of course, there were acute business problems that had to be addressed. No one can deny that. This is a period of head-spinning change in media consumption. The response to that is necessarily difficult and severely disruptive. Radical innovation is required. The Post's challenges, however, were made infinitely worse by ill-conceived decisions that came from the very top, from a gutless order to kill a presidential endorsement 11 days before the 2024 election, to a remake of the editorial page that now stands out only for its moral infirmity. Loyal readers, livid as they saw owner Jeff Bezos betraying the values he was supposed to uphold, fled the Post. In truth, they were driven away by the hundreds of thousands. Bezos' sickening efforts to curry favour with President Trump have left an especially ugly stain of their own. This is a case study in near-instant self-inflicted brand destruction. That decision to pull the paper's 2024 endorsement of Kamala Harris just days before the election, a decision handed down to its editorial team by Bezos, led 300,000 subscribers to flee the paper. But it wasn't Bezos' last bit of electoral interference. This is from the Financial Times. Bezos, who acquired the newspaper for $250 million in 2013, intervened in the newspaper's opinion section last February to focus more narrowly on two topics: personal liberties and free markets, leading to the departure of opinion editor David Shipley. When Bezos bought the Washington Post in 2013, some heralded the sale as a way to reinvigorate the paper. But by January 2025, Bezos, along with almost every other tech billionaire in the United States, had formed an all-too-cozy relationship with the Trump administration. Later that year, Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner were guests at Bezos' $50 million Venice wedding to Lauren Sanchez. And Bezos had also bankrolled the newly released Melania documentary/propaganda vehicle to the tune of $70 million, according to industry reports. The film has only made $7 million so far. Bernie Sanders summed up the situation like this. If Jeff Bezos could afford to spend $75 million on the Melania movie and $500 million for a yacht to sail off to his $55 million wedding to give his wife a $5 million ring, please don't tell me he needed to fire 1/3 of the Washington Post staff. Democracy dies in oligarchy. That's, of course, a play on the Washington Post's famous slogan, Democracy dies in darkness. Dalia, we often don't agree with the Washington Post's journalism, finding it all too cozy with power and uncritical of politicians, like much of the mainstream media. But does the involvement of a Trump-adjacent billionaire like Jeff Bezos in eviscerating it mean we should start to care?
I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something that this is the kind of question that I reckon with all the time. And the question is, is the era that we're looking at in not just American politics, but globally, is it unprecedented? Is it a radical break from the way things have always been? You can argue that the war in Iraq, the war in Vietnam, the Murdoch-owned press, all of these things are the precursor or the precedent that, for example, ICE and the way that Trump is, the kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela, the purchasing and dismantling of the press by billionaires like Jeff Bezos. You could argue, what is really the substantive difference between these kind of pre-Trump, post-Trump America? And by talking about how horrifically unprecedented these things are we romanticizing an era of American politics, of US politics that should not be romanticized? I think it's a really important question. I feel like every day I wake up on a different side of that argument, because ultimately, why would Jeff Bezos buy something like the Washington Post? He would buy and run something like the Washington Post for the same reason that billionaires or the super wealthy have always wanted to buy and own media, for the same reason that Rupert Murdoch or Roger Ailes has bought and owned media. Because, despite the fact that this is a loss-making industry, particularly now, it doesn't make profit. It's completely a bad business investment in an immediate sense. But the reason that as a billionaire you buy up media is because the return on investment is structural. You create a social and ideological context through which the various ways in which your business interests are going to have to come at the expense of the well-being financially, socially, psychologically of the majority of people. By buying up the press, you make sure that the narrative that can justify your right to do that is the public discourse, and that you buy off the possibility of these media institutions being populated by anyone that might question or challenge or be critical of that. So you're buying the public imagination and you're buying public discourse. And that's really important if you want to go on extracting and exploiting natural and human resources. So in a sense, it's like, okay, well, what's the difference between Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men on the planet, whose business models and whose, business practices are destroying our planet, are concentrating wealth in unimaginable ways away from the many and towards this one man. These are organically unpopular, destructive policies that if they were subject to any kind of genuine public scrutiny would fall apart. And so you stave off that criticism by buying up the venues of criticism. One of those is the Washington Post. It's also why Elon Musk bought Twitter. And it's why Twitter is not, Twitter was always a bit of a complicated place, but it was at some point a place where critical media was able to thrive and exist. And that is no longer the case. And so on the one hand, we can say, look, the wealthy have always bought and owned media for these purposes. But on the other hand, I do think that there is an unleashing of moral and political anarchy in the worst sense by, you know, the Jeff Bezoses and the Donald Trumps, etc. of the world, that is a product not just of a failing social contract, but is also the product of the extent of the inequality. You know, inequality has always been part of the DNA of capitalism, but as you know, we all read the same Oxfam report every year. The extent of that inequality, the extent of that disparity, when you hear sort of the percentage of global wealth owned by a tiny number of people, it has skewed things to such a degree that there is almost a tipping point where it feels like the very few levers of accountability that we once had, that didn't always work, that often failed, but nonetheless were there. The tipping point, the balance of power has tipped so aggressively that even those levers feel like they are becoming a distant memory. And so, yes, it is simply an acceleration of the dynamics that have always existed within capitalism, but it is an acceleration that has had a kind of qualitative impact that has made it more difficult than ever, but more urgent than ever to resist the kinds of political economy that exist under capitalism.
Yep, I don't think that democracy can survive an oligarchic class like we're seeing at the moment. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the very richest, that is the democracy of capitalist society. Now, one news outlet that will never be owned and then consummately ripped up by a billionaire is your very own Novara Media. But we can only do that thanks to your support at home. Go to novaramedia.com/support if you would like to help keep us going. Thank you, Dalia, for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Helena. Always a pleasure, of course.
The pleasure is always mutual as well. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.